Cyanoacrylate. Cyanoacrylate was discovered by Dr. Harry Coover all the way back in 1942. Dr. Coover was looking for a clear material for a gun sight that he was building for a rifle. The problem with cyanoacrylate, though, it was ill-equipped for the purpose. It literally stuck to everything with great strength. So he cast it aside. 16 years later, though, with the Eastman Chemical Company, he reintroduced that in a product called Eastman 910, what we now know today as Superglue. Now, this little material had great strength. This little thing could make a huge difference. In fact, in the Vietnam War, in the field of battle, they would close gaping wounds with superglue. In fact, just 9 drops of superglue just 3 years ago was able to lift up 10,000 pounds of weight. Today, I want to talk to you about a different type of glue. A type of glue that I think has the ability to change the way, fundamentally, that we do business. But first, a story. I want to tell you about Brandon Cook and his grandmother. 2.5 years ago, Brandon was visiting his grandmother in hospital. And unfortunately, she was down to her last days. She had pancreatic cancer. And one of the horrible side effects is that it truly messes with your digestive system. She was getting to the point where she could no longer eat. She looked at her grandson. She said, "Brandon," she said, "you know what I would really like? I'd really like some soup." But she said, "Not the crap they serve here at the hospital." She still had a sense of humor. She says, "What I would really like is a bread bowl of clam chowder from Panera." Now, this was a Monday in the summer. Panera only serves clam chowder on Fridays. But Brandon, being the millennial he is, simply reaches into his pocket, pulls out his smartphone, and he immediately gets Sue, the manager, in Nashua, New Hampshire. And without pause, Sue says, "Stop. Come on down. We'd be more than happy to help you." So Brandon goes down to the store. Sue gives him the 2 bowls of clam chowder. In fact, she gives Brandon a box of cookies for he and his grandmother to share. And he goes back to the hospital and he has a wonderful lunch with his grandmother. It really kind of sustained her. And he's driving home that day. He thinks to himself, you know, that was a little thing that Panera did. But it truly meant a lot to both him and his grandmother. It made her happy. So he thinks, I'm going to write about that experience. Now, how do we know Brandon Cook is a good kid? He's friends with his mom on Facebook. She sees it. She is so moved by the post, she copies it and places it here on Panera's Facebook page. And then something truly magical happened. Because when I came across this post just 3 weeks later, I was the 810,000th, 801st person to like this post. This single post got nearly 36,000 comments. Why? Why did this move people so much? You know, I'd like to think if I was Sue and I got that phone call, that I would have done the little extra. Maybe even been thoughtful enough to do the box of cookies. But what I know as a customer, and I think you'll all agree, what we may see here as common sense is definitely not common practice. I've worked in marketing for over 25 years. With some of the biggest brands out there, I've worked on huge campaigns. And this is what I know now. Your brand is no longer what you tell people it is. It's what your customer experiences, what they feel, and what they share to others. 6 years ago, I had something happen to me that changed my life, and I call it my moment of truth. Here I am in New York City on a rooftop bar with a colleague of mine, enjoying, as you only can in Manhattan, a $15 beer, if that's possible. And I notice there's an older gentleman sitting across from me. And it's obvious to me that he's waiting for someone, because every once in a while I can see him scan the room. So I start feeling bad for him. I lean in just to start conversation. And I say, do you know we spend 10% of our life waiting? Would you agree with that? And I know it's true because I once read it online. He looked at me and he laughed. He says, yeah, I am waiting for somebody. And I said, well, they're obviously not on time. And I'll never forget this. He gave me the strangest look and he said, on time? He said, no one is ever on time. He said, on time is a myth. And I said, what do you mean? I've been on time before, not often. And he gave me the Dikembe finger wave. And he said, no one is ever on time. He says, people in life are either early or they're late. No one is ever on time. And it was right then it clicked for me. Because the same thing applies in business with the customers that we already have. No one meets the expectations of a customer. You either exceed expectations or you fall short. And so given the choice of either doing more or doing less, I say choose more. I went home that night on a quest. I decided to start a project that I call the Purple Goldfish Project. And I sought to find 1,001 examples of companies that did the little extra. Now, I call these things a purple goldfish. Why purple and why a goldfish? The purple is an ode to an iconic American city and its most famous event. That city is New Orleans, and the event is Mardi Gras. Purple is one of 3 official colors: purple, green, and gold. And the reason why it's an ode to New Orleans is there's one word that comes from New Orleans that exemplifies this entire concept. One Creole word. In fact, one word that Mark Twain once said was worth traveling to New Orleans to get. And that one word is called lagniappe. French and Spanish, it literally means to give more or the gift. And it's customary if you're down in New Orleans for a business to do a little something extra at the time of purchase. Now, why a goldfish? I like the idea of the goldfish as something small, but I truly got inspired when I came across a place called Kimpton. And if you've ever stayed at a Kimpton hotel, you would know that they get the idea of the little extra. There's always gourmet coffee in the lobby. There's wine tasting for free in the afternoon. If you've got a dog, bring your dog. They're pet friendly. But my favorite, if you're staying at a Kimpton property, maybe you're getting a little lonely after a day or two, they will give you a pet goldfish for your stay. They call it guppy love. Now, I mentioned I was on a quest for 1,001 examples. And I have to tell you, it wasn't easy. Over the course of 3 years, I learned a lot about how companies purposefully can do that little extra. But 27 months later, I was able to finish that challenge and reach it to 1,001. And what I learned is this whole idea can be broken down to this, a thing that I call glue. Now, why glue? Glue is an acronym. The G is for give. And it's the idea of trying to go beyond just the transaction to create a relationship. One of the earliest examples in the project came from Doubletree hotels. When you check in at a Doubletree, the first thing you get is a chocolate chip cookie. Now, not just a regular chocolate chip cookie, warm, good size, packed with chocolate chips. My friend Jeff Hazlett, former CMO of Kodak, he loves these cookies so much, he says he dreams about them when he stays at other hotels. They've been doing it since the mid-1980s. In the past year, they gave away their 300 millionth cookie. G for give, the L is for little. It doesn't have to be something big. Many times it's about the offer and doing that little extra. One of the examples I truly love in the project comes from St. Paul, Minnesota, a place called Izzie's Ice Cream. When you buy a scoop of ice cream at Izzie's, they let you pick out another flavor, and they give you a mini scoop on top. That little mini scoop is the Izzie. And I love it as that little thing that gives you an additional taste. G for give, L for little. The U is for unexpected. Unexpected is about the idea of leveraging surprise and delight. If you can create an emotional response, that's gold. Because the way that we're put together is that when we have an emotional response, our brain floods our system with dopamine. And dopamine is literally the post-it note for our memory. Safelite Auto Glass. They'll come to your home or your office if you have a crack in your windshield. Now, they've got this funky thing that they put up onto the windshield, and they literally drill a hole right into the crack. And then they put an epoxy resin. It takes 10 minutes for that epoxy resin to harden. What the technician does, they go back to their van, they grab glass cleaner, and they grab a vacuum. For the remainder of that time, they do the entire interior of the car and all of your glass. Now when you walk out, not only miraculously does your windshield look like it's new, but your car looks like it just rolled off the showroom floor. Totally unexpected, totally memorable. G for give, L for little, the U is for unexpected, the E is for extra. And it's this idea of going above and beyond. In business, we all make mistakes, but it's how we handle those mistakes that can truly make the big difference. There's a company up from Canada called Nurse Next Door. They provide home health care services. When Nurse Next Door makes a mistake, they write a handwritten note of apology to their customer, but they also send a freshly baked apple pie to apologize. Literally a humble pie. Each year they spend $2,000 with a local vendor. They know it saves them over $100,000 in potential lost business. This is not a new concept of doing the little extra. In fact, nearly 58 years ago, Walt Disney did something truly signature. And at the time, Disneyland was only open for 2 years. Walt had an idea, though. For the entire month of December, he was going to do a parade right down Main Street. It was going to cost Disney $350,000. It's about $4 million today. Well, his accountants heard this, and they flipped. They immediately found Walt, and they sat him down. And they said, Walt, don't do the parade. They said, these people, they're already here in the park. They're not going to miss it because they're not even expecting it. Walt looked up at his accountants and in typical Walt fashion said, that's exactly why we need to do the parade. He said, here at Disneyland, we always need to give more than what our customer expects. He said, because if we don't, and they decide not to come back, it's going to cost us 10 times the amount of money to get them to come back. When you go to any Disney park today, what's the signature thing that Disney does? In fact, the most asked question at any Disney's park is this: what time is the 3 o'clock parade? Of course, people are asking, where do they need to be? What time do they need to show up? Walt's mantra was this: always exceed expectations. In fact, Walt had a word for it. He called it plussing. And he would drive the Imagineers and the cast members crazy, because he was always challenging to say, how can we do just a little bit more? How can we plus it up and give a little extra? My hope is that I finish today, you're thinking a little differently about the customers you have as opposed to chasing the customers you don't. Gartner released research recently that said by next year, 89% of businesses will compete solely on the customer experience. How are you going above and beyond to exceed the expectations of your customer? Are you ready to give little unexpected extras? What's your parade? Your chocolate chip cookie? What's your purple goldfish? Thank you.